So, this is what we're talking about. How to speak designer. If this is not what you actually want to hear, then you are in the wrong room, and you should leave now, because if you leave in like 5 minutes, I will take it personally. So, like, you know, yeah. So, who am I? I'm the mobile technology manager for the Nerdy. So what does that mean? Basically means that our mobile practice rolls up to how we do it, what we do, what our standards or our practices are. So you might be wondering, why am I here talking about being a designer? Because this is the other thing that I am. I'm an odd duck. If we actually take a look at kind of like my history and how I got to where I am, I graduated school with degrees in journalism and political science, went to work doing print media design, moved into multimedia design, spent a time doing web work, moved into interactive design in the days of Flash. That went away as soon as kind of like Steve Jobs said that it was dead, because apparently. And then, you know, we moved past that into the mobile world, and I've been doing that for a number of years now. And so I've kind of lived and touched a number of these portions of the stack of what we do. I've worked as a designer, and I've worked as a developer. And I kind of remember some of the things that I did in each spot, and what worked and what didn't. And so as we start this kind of question of like, how do I actually speak to a designer, or how do I speak designer, how do we communicate? I think it's important to ask this question. Like, in a general sense, what does it actually take to speak someone's language? To actually make sure that you are understanding them and they are understanding you? And how do you actually approach that? And there are two things that I usually emphasize. First, empathy, and second, curiosity. If we can start from understanding what they think about, where a person's concerns are, what they are interested in hearing, what they want to know, then we're going to have a really strong foundation for actually being able to communicate effectively. Excellent. So let's take a look at how this actually plays out. Because there's some fairly common things that show up between designers and developers in places where we're like, these are places where we kind of butt heads or we misunderstand each other. And these are ones that I've seen over and over again. I've seen on the designer side that it's often very easy for people to overestimate the cost of putting out another one, right? You might say, I'm going to put out a 5-page website. I already have a template. I don't care if you put out 10 pages, right? It's all data to me at some point in time, right? But it's easy for a designer to say, no, it's the page count, right? Or you're going to underestimate sometimes the cost of doing a one-off change in one particular page, right? This one page just needs to be a little different than all of the other ones, and sometimes that's a little bit of a hard task. And sometimes on the design side, people may not account for the impact of basically variations that come from a device or data or the environment. You don't actually kind of see what happens when things change. On the developer side, there's a whole different set of things that people do. First off, very often a developer is going to try to kind of shoehorn things into a very narrow band of consistency, right? We want things to look the same so we can stamp out a lot of these things. They will sometimes miss details on designs, right? They'll say, well, this is about right. So I saw this. This is the same thing. And this is the fun one that really works for people, is a lot of times they'll surprise people with kind of like, yeah, I can do this super easy, and then they ask for another small change. Yeah, I can move this thing up 2 pixels, but I can't move it up 10 pixels because that's like 100 hours. But 2 pixels, it's 15 minutes. And people are like, why? Why would you do that to me, right? You know, and it's really hard to explain. So I think a metaphor is sometimes helpful to kind of sit down and understand, where does that come from? What is the difference that actually drives that? And so for me, I kind of look at, what does a person do on a day-to-day basis? How do they approach their craft? What are the tools that they're spending time with? If I'm a designer, I'm working in Photoshop very often, right? I might be working in OmniGraffle, but I'm working in something where I'm tactily moving things around, right? And if I want to make a change on a particular element, I actually just go into that element and I make the change, right? That's actually exactly what I do. And if I need to make a change on 10 elements, I go in there and I make a change on 10 different elements most of the time. There are some exceptions and ways you can automate things, but generally actually that's the flow, right? That's what you're doing. You're touching those things every single time. If I'm a programmer, that is not what I am doing. If I'm a programmer, I actually, to a great extent, am not even necessarily building the views or the things that people see. I am actually building a factory that builds the views that people see, right? I put together something, I give instructions for how that's going to get put together, how it needs to be understood, and then out of that, that gets put out. That has some really important implications, right? Because you can think about it, right? You know, if I'm over here, I've designed my production line, and I can output oak chairs, I can output mahogany chairs, and maybe I can like have different fabric I put on top of my chairs. But what happens when I want to make a bigger chair in these two scenarios, right? Well, it might look something like this, right? So, on the design side, it's like, yes, here we go. I made my chair bigger, right? I had all the pieces, I just did it. But over here, all of a sudden, I had to like actually tear down my entire production line in order to make the small change. And the thing that's amazing about that is it's an implied constraint. Like, no one sees the factories. They don't know where that boundary is. It's there, it's real, it's a part of it, but no one knows where it is. And so it's starting to get to a point where we can actually talk that through. That's really important. And so if we come back to where these places are that we see that we have problems talking, I see a lot of it coming back to that mental model, right? I can look at this and say, this cost the incremental cost of producing additional units. Well, yeah, because day in and day out, when someone is working in Photoshop, if I want to produce a new thing, I have to copy and paste that. And if I want to make changes or keep that flexible, I'm actually touching a lot of different things. That feels like a lot of work, right? If I'm going to do more of that, underestimating the cost of one-off contextual variations, sometimes, yeah, because I'm touching everything, I can make those changes naturally. I'm not building a factory. But that not accounting for the especially longer short data, again, like I'm touching it, I'm in there, I put it together, I see it, like I'm crafting what I want right in front of me. This is the approach. Come over here to the developer, I gotta get things to fit in my line. I gotta get it so I can actually get it to come out the door. I've gotta make it in a way that I can actually repeat it and have it be something that I can do. I have to define where the edges of my tolerances are so I can have those assumptions in place. And then, since I'm actually mentally building a pattern, I may not actually be paying attention to every detail. I'm going to look and say, can I make these things a little bit more generic? Can I fit them together? Can I have them? And that causes problems. And of course, there's this, why was it more expensive to do this than that? It's because there are these implied constraints that people don't see. So what do we do about that? Like, as a developer, how do you actually go about trying to be better about approaching and helping people with that? Where I start is here. You're always kind of in this place of negotiation, of talking, of working with the designer. It's a partnership. And one of the first things you do is when someone comes to you and says, here, look at the cool thing I built, it's a time to sit down and understand what they built. Take a look at it, do an inventory, do a deep dive on what you were given, so that you can come back and have a fruitful conversation. So there are a few things you should probably take a look at every time you get new design documents. We're going to look at all the text attributes, we're going to look at colors and opacities, and we're going to look at design variations. What kinds of things are likely to change. And this is going to be a great place for you to actually start the conversation so you can figure out, okay, this is what I can actually get to building, and this is where the actual real important details are. So if you're looking at text, there are a few things to start having kind of a conversation around. And we're going to go through a few attributes. First one, font face, weight, and size. It's kind of the basic, right? It's usually right where you start for almost anything you want to position, you want to lay out. And things will look radically different depending on what you do. The first thing you should ask anytime someone gives you a font and you look at it and you're like, hey, that's not a system font, is do you have a license for this? Because that's actually really an important question to make sure that you actually have it nailed down, because you want to answer that question before everyone's gone far enough down. There are legal limitations around that. But once you got that nailed down, write it down. You've got font face, you've got hypertext, it's weight regular, size 32. Over here I've got rubato, I've got black, I've got 32. Write it down, make sure you start actually getting this. Inventory, just make a line for basically every single line of text you saw anywhere in the document. After that, the next thing to take a look at, in terms of attribute, is your line spacing. And you're going to get variations on those, right? People are going to express it in different ways, you'll measure it differently. You know, if you look at the way that Android likes to get it, you can either do it as an addition, where you're actually specifying the space between lines, or as basically a multiplication factor off the actual font size. You can kind of pick how you want to. Usually just, you need to start by actually measuring. Understand what that value is, write it down, get your line height. You know, you're going to see things that are really important, like over here, if I'm setting something in all caps, I don't have these little things, descenders, hanging down off my text. And so a lot of times people are going to snug things up, and it'll be tighter there. And that's actually really important, right? That makes that look and feel good and right. And you need to capture that when you set it back into your app. Otherwise, it's going to feel wrong. It won't match the designs, it won't match the comp. People won't see it. Next thing you need to make sure you do is actually do this one. Now this one has always been kind of a tricky one, particularly on mobile devices, that ability to actually kind of watch and match letter spacing and kerning. Some of those typography details have been late coming to the APIs. It's just taken a while for them to get there, but they are there now. And start paying attention to it, measure it, because again, it makes a difference. And you're going to see it in the space between. You're going to see something if you're in here and it's in all caps. You want a little bit of extra space, a little bit of extra room just to kind of let it breathe. And helping people understand that, if you see those details, even so you can talk to them about it and say, hey, we can't reach that in this platform level, or this is what the cost is if I'm going to be doing this, it starts the conversation because they put those details in there intentionally. When you get done, you want to have something that looks kind of like this. You're going to have like a name for every single piece of text you saw that was handed over to you. You're going to have the font face that everyone used. You have the sizes, 16, 17, 44, 17, 14, 12, the letter spacing for each one of those. But this lets you start having a really interesting conversation. Because all of a sudden, you're like, man, I got Roboto 17, leading 20, all the same across. Why is this one 16? Did you mean to do that? Or was that just something that maybe when you were going through your document, you didn't hit that one, right? And it's a question, it's a conversation, it's a place to start actually making sure, yeah, I paid attention. I saw what you did, understood it, and this. Let's pay attention to what we did. One of the things that's super fun is this works not just with text. This is actually something that I would usually recommend that you do with your images too. Go through, look at your designs, find the places where you're putting in images. Write down the actual dimensions of every single thing you got in there. Write down the pixel sizes, write down the aspect ratios, and make sure that there's some coherence between those. And then you can, again, have a conversation. Hey, your square, or, you know, it's in a circle, so it's mostly square, right? You know, masking it to a circle or something like that, right? You're basically in those kind of dimensions everywhere, but over here we've got the one place where we're doing it differently. Well, that means there's probably something that has to do some cropping. There's something that we have to do some thinking about how we actually fit our images into those holes. And let's have the conversation about how those pieces are going to work together. Similarly, you have color. You cannot write red and expect it to be true all the way through, right? We got red over here, specific hex value. This is red with the same hex value but a different opacity blended against white. And this is actually the same end color at full opacity, right? All three of those will render very differently, right? Knowing what your context is going to let you do the right thing. And so sometimes it's not going to be just opening up the element and looking at it. You're going to maybe sometimes have to fire up the eyedropper and measure it there. But again, write it down. Understand what are the things that are affecting it, that are driving it, so you can have, again, that inventory to have the conversation. Because it's all about starting to get to the place where you're talking about and you figure out where the edges are. So, the other one I want to talk about are blend modes, because these are the ones that kind of sneak up and bite you in the tuchus. A lot of times, they can be a really powerful thing. And like, you can set up and say, okay, I'm going to multiply. I'm going to set my blend mode, multiply, and all of a sudden, what that means is based on the luminance of what I've got, it's going to darken based on the image in the background. super cool. And what that means is like if I have like a gradient or something like that, I can make it kind of fade out or gives this kind of smooth blend in for a shadow usually. Really nice. Generally speaking, you're probably not implementing it that way once you actually get the program, right? Or if you slice out an image that has blend mode on it, and you take that image over into your application and it doesn't have the same blend mode when you then go to composite it, it's not going to look the same. You're actually better off measuring it, recognizing there's a blend mode, working out what the final actual color should be, and get to the end spot. Which you can do. This is the formula for it. It's kind of a pain in there. You're better off oftentimes just kind of doing a little bit of the work to say, okay, a lot of times when you actually see these things show up, where they show up are usually on shadows and glows, right? They're filter effects that kind of are on the side, and if you tilt the color of your filter, if you tint the color of the filter effect, it's going to be a bigger issue. But it basically darkens based on the luminance. And what you'll see is you can basically kind of do a straight, if I take that luminance value, and I take the original color values, and I just multiply each channel by that luminance value as a percentage, it'll probably give you a pretty good denormalized version of it. You could actually just take it and not actually have to deal with the blend, right? And that'll save you. It makes it easier, and it makes it that you're actually matching the design. So, recently, at our office, we did a code challenge where we had developers from across the office submit bots that were responsible for playing in a prisoner's dilemma game. And we ran these rounds of hosted challenges for our people to compete. And so we wanted to have a scoreboard so we could talk about it to the company and say, like, here's where we are at. So I went to one of my favorite designers that I like to argue with a lot, myself, and I made a design for it. It was great. I put it up, built it out, we put it up on the screen. I took one look at it and I said, son of a bitch. Turned around, walked away, made about 10-15 minutes worth of changes, came back, and had a much better one. So my question is, can you spot the problem in my design?
I don't know what information it's conveying to me.
That's a problem. Yeah. Here's another one. So they're fighting hundreds of, we're doing 100 rounds. They accumulate years every time. We're going to be up in the thousands. That's a reasonable number of years that someone's going to accumulate. Right? You know, like they're going to jail for a little while, most of them. And, you know, you look at this, you have people with long names. This looks like ass. Right? You have to account for the fact that, like, you can start with a design that looks good, that fits to a particular format. You know, it looked fine with the 4. The other thing here is, like, look, that 4 looks nice hanging off a line to the edge of that, right? This looks way out of balance. That doesn't work. It took me about 5 minutes to move over to something that looked like that. And it wasn't a huge change, it wasn't a big thing, but being able to deal with those design variations, that's a real thing. And on mobile in particular, and Android in particular, it's huge. You have resolution changes, you have addressable DPI changes, you've got big, big changes that happen in there. And so there are a number of things, as you get into that we usually recommend people look for. Try it out with long names, numbers. If you want to kind of stress yourself out, put German words in there because those things really get long, or just double up the words that are in there. Look for places where things might break to multiple lines. Understand what that does to kind of the flow of things. Understand, put some boundaries around where those edges are. Look at your screen sizes. How do things flow? How do they stretch? Where are the boundaries? Talk through that conversation with people. Watch your image aspect ratios. Talk about what happens if I'm loading an image from the internet and it comes in portrait and I have a landscape pull. What do I do with that? Do I center it? Do I fill it? How do I fit those things together? Go through those things, inventory them, understand them. And then again, you can have that really positive conversation with the designer that gets you to a place where, rather than at the end of the thing where people are saying, why does this look weird or off, or I didn't expect this, you're actually designing and moving forward up front. So, I want to talk a little bit about one thing here that's a bit of a sweet spot for me, and it's a thing that I care a little bit more about, and it's animation. Animation, I think, is one of those things that people, they underestimate the power that it can have, the power it can have in terms of telling a story, and the effect it can have to really kind of elevate an application. And when I look at animation, I think one of the things that people need to kind of keep in mind is it's a little bit like a spice, right? When you're cooking something and you're making something, a little bit goes a long way. And doing it well, and focusing and polishing a few parts can make all the difference between something simple and something really complicated. And I've been trying to think of a good metaphor because I'm a person who likes metaphors. And my son, 7 years old, and he's been taking guitar lessons recently. And so like the first thing he's been starting to work through is Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, right? And this is a very serviceable thing. You go through, he's got timings, and he starts here and moves through and he plays. And it's a song. It's recognizable as a melody, and it can be pretty sometimes. I'm biased, but I think so. And to a great degree, that's a lot of, I think, where we sometimes start our animation conversation. Let's do a crossfade, right? Let's do something simple. But if we're only doing one thing at a time, we're kind of missing the opportunity. Because this is what, like, music really starts to look like at some point, right? I have multiple lines of things happening at the same time, right? We've got things coming in and out in sequence, in concert with each other, that are related in time and over space. And that's, I think, what we want to aim at. So when we start thinking about what does good animation do, we want to aim at a place where we're thinking, what does it look like to do something big? So let's look at this again. How would we animate this, right? Because there's changes that happen. We're going to have multiple rounds, different people going off against each other, different things that we could approach, right? The simplest thing you could do is a straight crossfade. And it would work. And it would not be jarring, it would feel fine, and in fact, it would probably meet kind of the minimum level of polish. But you could step past that, right? You can start saying, well, hey, wouldn't it be fun if maybe these things split off the top and bottom, right? We'll have them come off the top and bottom and come back on. Because like Jansen happens to be a PHP developer and Jay's a mobile developer, and we're gonna actually change the background colors when different people come in so that we can kind of communicate a little bit more information. So we want to keep those things consistent as they go. So we'll take these two things off the top and bottom, which is great. But as I do that, I start looking and I'm like, wait a minute, these numbers here, those look weird as they're cropping off the top and bottom. You know what I need to do? I need to fade these out before they get off the top and bottom. And then when I bring it back in, I'll fade them back in. Those two things together become a part of a sequence, a part of what you're doing. Once they're off, I gotta be doing something with this too. I have to get these to a neutral state that I can transition to something else. And these are things that should all be happening together. Each one of them in their own place, you can tell an interesting story. You can take a look at the round number in terms of what's happening there, resetting that, how you approach it. Each one of those makes a big piece. And if you tie them together like that, you get something that's much more powerful than any individual part of it. As you approach those things, pay attention to what the platform is, right? There are natural easing and motion work that's been done for you. Use it. Because that's going to be what helps make you feel like you belong on the platform you are on. You know, when we say easing, I think most of you guys probably know that phrase, but it's just like, it's how things move, right? It's have I set up and got things, they move very quickly across the screen and just like hard starts and stops, or do things slow into place, right? And there are rules around that, right? And basically kind of the rules that I usually follow when I look at kind of like how do we handle easing are, if I can see it, then I probably need to ease it. If its end spot is Or if its end or beginning spot is in a place where I can't see it, then I probably don't. So I might, if I was moving this off the screen, have an ease in on the move off, but I don't need to slow it down as it goes off the screen. People can imagine that it slows down when it goes off the screen. And I can converse that on the other side, right? But if you're moving it, otherwise you should basically kind of, you can see it, you should cut that. The exception that I sometimes make is actually for alpha. I tend to find on a personal layer that if I'm doing opacity or alpha changes, I will usually for those actually do those linear. I tend to think those look better without any actual easing attached to them, but usually I'll start there. So one of the things I want to kind of emphasize and I want to come back to is that if you're going to build something good, you need to recognize the skill set that each person has. And you have to get to a point where it's not like the designer gave it to me, I go off and I do it, and it's my job to get it out the door. It's a partnership. It's something you need to be working through on each together. A good creative director will make or break work. They will give you feedback on things you do not see. It will help you fine-tune things that start good and make it great. It's like having a good QA engineer, right? They'll piss you off. Like, don't make no mistake on that. They will do that to you. But that's their job, right? Because they're asking you to be better. They're asking you to elevate your game. And understand that. Work with that. Plan for that. And when you do, you're going to start getting some big returns off that. The other thing is, that's a partnership that goes two ways. Because if you just leave kind of like the design, the interaction, back to the designer before it even gets to kind of the actual work, if you're not a part of what's happening back at the design side of it, you're also going to be missing opportunities. Because you've got a perspective they don't, in terms of what's possible, in terms of how you can actually represent things programmatically. You know, there are things you can look at, and I think a classic example of that is like the pull to refresh gesture, which actually came from a developer. And it's something because, like, as a developer, they were able to look at it and say, I understand that I have an event stack here that I can manipulate, I can change, I can fit together, so I can use that as a trigger. That's not necessarily where a designer would have started, because it's not necessarily a piece that they would have actually said, yes, I can actually fit that in. And so that's a big change. You, as a developer, have a perspective that will help them understand what you can do, what is possible, and that's a huge thing. So, I want to save some time. Open up for questions. Dylan, you were going to throw rotten tomatoes at me. Promise to heckle. So.
I forgot the rotten tomatoes.
Okay.
A rotten banana.
Nice! Yeah.
I think because of the personality type that's often associated with developers, there's a lot of resources now about how developers can talk to recruiters, how developers can talk to designers. Are there resources in the other direction too? Because we can be difficult to talk to at times as well.
We can be very difficult to talk to at times. You know, there are some resources for that, and actually, like Lacey, I wonder if you have any that you want to share. Lacey's one of my coworkers at Canada. She actually is from our UX group. Anything you've been reading recently you want to?
I can't recall the name of anything, but I know there are some emerging articles. It's actually a relatively new conversation, which is surprising to me, but there is some stuff out there on all the big stuff, all the big publications about something.
Have you as a designer or you as a developer come across any personal tips to make ourselves more accessible? These are awesome for that end of the conversation.
So I think, you know, some of it comes down to how you, when you start an engagement, when you sit down and you say, okay, I'm going to actually, we are building a thing, we're putting together a team, understanding how that works. It's starting to actually have the conversation up front. What are the roles? How much time are each of us spending at different points? What are we focusing on? What is the end goal? What do the users need to see out of it at the end of the problem, at the end of the time? And making sure that we can answer those questions. Because if you set it up, you can actually say, okay, we're gonna have a developer kind of meeting, checking in, doing things like, I don't know, giving an estimate off the wireframes when we do the changes. That's a big thing. All of a sudden, rather than just having wireframes and it comes over to dev and people are like, what's the cost basis? Did we change things from our proposal? Was no, we understand the choices. We've been talking to people about what the cost is as well. Those kinds of things can have a really profound effect.
It's like a product, you mentioned this earlier probably, but the gap in the developer and the designer, when you give them a design, the developer gives the design, what kind of things that you take into consideration that there is no guessing on the developer side of things? How do you give them an HTML, CSS?
Usually I prefer, like in terms of the handoff, there are a couple of things I specifically prefer. First, I prefer a comp that like, if I am actually rendering at that size, I can lay underneath the image and actually just do a straight image compare. I want to be able to make sure that I can do that much. I like something that specifies specifically how things are expected to change over time. So if we're going to say, we're flexing the size of a screen, which is going to happen, like that's just the world we live in, what parts are expected to flex? Where do we actually account for those pieces? And then the other big one that I really like to see is a style guide. And if we don't have a style guide going in, then going back and basically kind of starting that conversation to say, let's build one by itemizing what we actually have in there is a really good place to start that. That gets you to a place where you can actually make educated changes, or you can actually run into a situation that may not have been already solved for, and actually still, as the developer, do the right thing. Right.
For animations, how do you have designers usually communicate what they want in terms of animation? Do designers have good tools for making animations in something like Illustrator, or do you prefer just a textual, I want this thing to go over here?
So, that's a great question. The things that I've seen that have worked well are, first, you can either have the conversation and have them kind of tell you the story. I think better than that is actually motion comps from After Effects can go along with. Something that, that's usually a tool that a lot of people will be very comfortable with and can actually show you exactly the movement that they're looking for. Sometimes those motion comps won't be using exactly the right easy pairs for the platform, so you may have to have a conversation around that and set some expectations there. But that's usually a good place to start. There are other tools that are out there. You've got things like was formed from Relative Wave. You've got Principle that came out recently. There's Framer that's out there. There are a number of them. Actually, Google has been buying a number of them. We've seen that. So it's definitely, I think, an evolving space of interest. I don't think I've seen anything where it's like, this is the perfect place for that actual transfer. You have things like the origami stuff that Facebook put out too, but some of those get really nerdy, really nerdy once you get into patches and things like that. They don't really kind of tell it. I think starting simple is good. One of the key things that I usually recommend is make sure you have a way to slow them down. And that's a really important thing. And that can be as simple as just making sure you have a constant that you can multiply across all of your timing values, so you can change it and finesse it and be able to look at it in detail together. Because oftentimes where you will get your best feedback is just spending an hour or two with the person who is the animator and having them come in and say, let's adjust this a beat, right? And they will use that word, let's move this a beat. And you're like, what is a beat? Well, if you think about it, again, back to that music analogy, there is a rhythm, right? You can have you can divide things up and say, I got maybe 3 or 4 major kind of movements or parts of this. And these things all have their own internal thing. And those timings should be mathematically related. You should be able to look and say, oh, this is happening over a second. I'm going to actually spend probably a quarter getting things off the screen, a quarter getting things back onto the screen, and then kind of the middle transition takes over the other piece, the other half of kind of whatever you say the time before. And being able to kind of think that through makes a big difference. And then you can also scale. But being able to slow things down can make a huge difference, because if you're doing a really fast animation, sometimes you'll miss kind of tiny things, and it'll just appear to you as like a J. Or like the thing that's really annoying is when you don't see it, but the creator director's like, there's something there, play it back, and you just kind of go back on it over and over and over again until finally you guys can name what it is, and usually once you named it, it's like a 5-minute change, right? Once you can name it, right?
I'll follow up on naming things. I don't have a design background,
Yeah.
but that shared language seems really important. Can you point to any resources, like, I don't need to become a master of Photoshop, but an online course, a book or something to pick up that language?
You know, things that I would actually pay attention to is type. Like, if you wanna start talking to designers better, learn to talk type. There are a number of kind of fairly easy primers that get you started in that space. And if you want to, like, you can just have some by designer by wandering around and saying that Arial is a horrible font, and being able to pick it out of when you see it out. If you do that, and then like you're halfway to being a picky designer. Yeah, but I would say like understand kind of what the parts of type are, how type works, how to set up a typographic hierarchy, what people are usually trying to do there. Those things I think will make a big difference. And then once you've done that, you can start looking at and just kind of maybe drawing boxes around major regions on a page so you understand how the blocking of something works, what alignment on the page itself looks like. And again, that will help you see so you can talk about it and say, I think you were going for this. This makes sense. But a lot of it comes back to understanding where they're coming from and the tools that they work. I can't emphasize enough, do that inventory, because if you do that, that's going to spark the conversations.
Awesome, thanks.
So, as a developer, specific to fonts for mobile, I've been saying a lot at Google I/O and WWDC about how much work they put into making the fonts work at different screen sizes and for accessibility at even different accessibility points that
Yes.
Many people may not really think of initially. So when a designer comes to me and says, I want to use all these great new fonts, the first thing I always come back with is,
Why?
well, yeah, why? Is that is that fair for me as a developer to come back and argue that maybe we
Yes.
should just stick with the platform font if it's
Yes,
for a mobile
it
app?
is absolutely, because I think, again, that comes back to you being kind of an active part of that process and being able to speak to what the platform provides. A lot of designers will have different levels of expertise within mobile itself, right? They may be excellent designers, may be very good web designers, but they may not have done or be quite as familiar with what happens on mobile itself. And so being able to speak to, this is actually what we do here, and this is why we do it, and this is the benefit you get if you're actually using Roboto, if you're doing the right things. That makes a big difference. And a lot of times people will look at it and be like, yeah, I see that. And then they'll adapt. Especially if you can come back to them and talk to them about what the potential budget costs or the licensing costs are, that also will help drive that conversation fairly easy.
So sometimes I'll end up on projects where we don't necessarily have an assigned designer and the person picking our font is like a business analyst or something like that. And when you ask them, do we have the rights to this, they say, I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you do at that point to figure out if it's a freely available font, or how do you find that information?
So-
How do you use this resource?
Google it. Take the font name, Google it, find it. You should be able to find the foundry. They will be published in licensing terms. And if it isn't explicitly listed as free, it's probably not. And so, people spend a lot of, seriously, type is one of the nerdiest, this is a developer conference, but let me just tell you, type is nerdy. And the people, they spend a ton of time crafting the fonts that go out there. And, it's a business, and they need to make their money too. So, you can find it. It's usually not that hard to figure out what the license situation is. And there are different licensing terms that you'll get for embedding a font in a mobile application versus, say, using it in a web environment versus using it just even in a corporate environment. And so, understanding all of those is very important. But particularly if you're putting it in a web application, because one of the things to keep in mind is almost anything you embed into a web application at some point in time, if someone was really interested, they could probably yank out. They could probably get that font back out. use it themselves. That's a thing to watch out for.
What's your comments or recommendations to approach designing the theme that the designer give you from the perspective of building it on top of a UI framework versus just sketching it, like coding the design from scratch? How to approach?
I would say, whenever possible, be right on top of the UI framework. You want to, and if they are deviating too much from where the platform conventions are, that is a place you need to have that conversation. Make sure that they understand that what choices they're making, how they're, what the cost impact is for that. A lot of times, if you can make sure that like you are actually within the platform space, it's going to be cheaper, better maintained. It's going to be something that actually is going to work well going forward. What you will find sometimes, a lot of times when I look at a design, is that there may be one or two elements where it's like, this is the place where they really want to put their emphasis, where they really want to kind of like deviate a little bit of a stamp on it. That's a place where you talk a little bit more about how do you make this match what you want. But have that kind of that strong underpinning of everything you already have that is given to you from the platform. And it's just really talking, I think, a lot about budget and a lot about how you perceive or will be perceived alongside your peers, the other apps that are on the platform. How well do you feel like you fit in with the device that is in someone's pocket? Is it jarring to move into that application, right? Because all of a sudden I feel like I'm into a totally different world, or do I feel like I'm a part of kind of the same thing? Because I think mobile devices are particularly personal kind of device. They are, I think, very tactile, and I think almost kind of a remote control for your world around you, people who live with them in that space. And so I think, if you are jarring people or taking them out of kind of their safe space when they take it in, they will not like that. And so, yeah. Does that answer your question? Kind of? Or did I miss the?
Like how to approach customizing the UI framework versus just coding the design that you were given from the design from scratch.
I think
it answers a little bit, but
I think like it's very contextual, right? You have to start with each design element and actually look at like how could I achieve this within what's already there, right? You have to take each one and say, okay, is this something that I would have to code from scratch, or is this something that I can actually do in terms of what's already there? What's there is really flexible. So start by trying to figure out how to do it in what you have before you jump outside. Anything else?
Sure. Come back to the animation tool question.
Yeah.
Near my part. So we had the issue that someone was alluding to where like, the tools that the designers were using didn't necessarily have to be available on the platform, and then you have to figure out how to communicate back and forth. So is it, so take the example of After Effects,
Right.
the catchphrase for Lollipop on my team was, well, it worked in After Effects.
Right, what could go wrong?
But the trick is getting the details to either side, so that the designers understand the constraints of the platforms and the developers understand what the designers are trying to do. So take a simple example of an easing curve. The designer can come up with a custom animation, and they can move this thing so it feels really great to them, and the developer's looking at it going, I don't have any idea what curve I'm supposed to apply.
Right.
I have ease in, out, I have some Bezier path stuff.
Right.
What is it you want? So the question, sorry, I'm monologuing.
No, it's good.
The question was, is it better for the developers to come up with some mechanism to share those easing curves with the designers? You know, output values into a spreadsheet and a chart or whatever, draw the curves for them, whatever it is, or for the designers to, since I don't know those tools, actually work within After Effects and say, okay, here is the curve for this thing.
So, I think, like, coming back to, I think, like, the platform that has some native, actually, it has a visual approach, right? Like, you guys are doing that very, very heavily, right? You use consistent curves across a lot of what you do, which is one of the reasons why, like, there are defaults for what you're presenting. I think getting started there is really what I think the right place to go. Like, that's how I would want to approach it.
So communicate those constraints constraints back to you.
Communicate the constraints back to the designer, have them start with that. If they really feel they need to move outside of that, then I think that has to become a question of like, really, what is it that we're gonna actually do? And it's something that I think then that developer needs to really kind of figure out, like, what is our actual handoff on that kind of stuff? How are we gonna translate this if we go back to it? But I think starting with some of those real constraints will probably be a better path for most effects as it goes through.
Generally, how do designers kind of quantify their necessity for changes or for any particular aspect of their project? As a developer, you can quantify by hours and how long it's going to take and it's going to cost, but if a developer wants to make a small change or pardon me, designer wants to make a small change that's going to cost you 100 hours and you don't feel it's necessary, what kind of terms do they use to discuss why they need what they need and why they think it's as important as they do?
I think, a lot of times when you get down to those questions, it comes down to a question of value and budget, right? I mean, at the end of the time, almost all these things need to translate back up to a business case, right? Like what is it that we're actually doing? What is the investment we're putting in to actually get the effect? And so like from your space, giving accurate estimates, helping people understand what the cost effect is based on what the state of the project is the number one thing that we can provide for people, so that we can sit down and everyone can sit down and have a discussion of like, what is the right thing to do? And then the designer can say, okay, this is what we think that means in terms of our brand position. This is what it means in terms of the user effect and the impact that that's going to have on them. And then you can have someone else say, okay, well, I still have to pay people, maybe I can't afford it. Right? Like you can have that discussion because it's going to fit into all of that. And so that's usually where
Sure.
But a lot of it also comes down to like, if you say that it's going to take 100 hours, like make sure that it will too. Really take a hard look and say, is there anything I could do that would actually help bridge that gap? What is the closest I could get to that? Are there other options that would maybe get us part of the way there, or that would kind of maybe be an alternate approach to get at what the designer wants? Because sometimes it's more about kind of what the end goal is than it is about this particular solution. So like maybe there's a solution that's less cost effective, but they just don't know where the constraints are. And it's getting into that dialogue is really important. Because again, coming back to that metaphor at the beginning, right? As a developer, you build a factory, right? You are not outputting views, you're outputting things that output views. And so you build tolerances into your factory for what you can and can't account for. But those tolerances aren't always visible to someone else. They don't know where those boundaries are. And so it's going to be really important for you to communicate those back. We're about 10 minutes before the next one. I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you everyone for hosting DevFest this time. It's a volunteer effort, so I mean, if you have a chance, you see any of the people around here who have been helping kind of keeping this going, I'm sure they would love it if you gave them a hug. I'm just going to say that right now. So yes, please do that, especially if it's Patrick Fuentes. I'm sure he'd really love that. Yeah, he probably would, yes. So anyway, but thank you very much. I really appreciate coming out, my talk, and I'll be hanging out here for a little bit afterwards if anyone wants to just chat.